Good morning, bon dia. Thank you all for coming this morning. I'm Michael Shifter of the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Dialogue is extremely pleased to collaborate with the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center in this event. I want to thank Peter and Jason, who you'll be hearing from in a moment, as well as the wonderful team here at the Atlantic Council, Natalie, Abby, and others. Thank you very much. I've been asked to make some opening remarks before the panel that's going to focus on the fascinating Brazilian elections and what we might expect from Dilma Rousseff's second term, which begins on January 1st, 2015. I guess I've been asked to talk about headwinds and tailwinds. I always get those two mixed up, so I hope you excuse me if I confuse those. Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, as you know, narrowly defeated Aécio Neves of the Brazil's Social Democratic Party last Sunday. For many of us in the United States, a bitter campaign marked by aggressive personal attacks, charges and countercharges of corruption and nepotism may not seem that unusual. But Brazilians, I don't think, were too accustomed to such nastiness in their campaign. It's tempting now, given the closeness of the vote, to draw the conclusion that Brazil is sharply divided, and in some respects, it certainly is sharply divided. The poor and the Brazilians from the north and northeast prefer Dilma over Aécio, so there are certainly social and geographic divisions. But I think it's worth asking how polarized the country actually is in ideological terms. After all, the campaign, I think, showed that in a broad sense, Brazilians want the same things and want it all. An economy that's growing, that's not stagnant as it is today, lower inflation, continued highly popular social welfare programs, and less corruption and better public services. They want, in short, change. There is, I suspect, some overlap between what Dilma will do now and what Aécio would have done if he were elected. But there is also very bad blood between both camps, and it won't be easy to heal the wounds and overcome the bitterness of this campaign. There are those who believe that Dilma is hopelessly wedded to economic policies that have led to such a serious situation in Brazil, and that she'll continue to pursue those policies in the second term. They believe she simply won't be able to restore investor confidence and rebuild credibility. Others, though, are convinced she knows some adjustments are necessary to get the economy growing again. They argue that the country's economic model has reached its limit and must become more open. The key question is whether Dilma will go down a more business-friendly, market-oriented path than she did during her first term. Can she do that politically? And if she goes down that path, how far will she go and can she go? Will it be enough to really make a difference? What we do know is that she will have a new finance minister and probably make changes in virtually all cabinet positions and in her team. So there will be some change. Her second-term team will be very telling about which direction economic policy she plans to pursue. And I think it will also tell us a lot about her foreign policy and relations that she wants to pursue with the United States, which have been quite distant and quite strained since the Snowden affair. And finally, there's the question about the political coalition. She's now politically weak. She faces a challenge of building a coalition, getting support in the context of growing concerns about corruption and questions about clean and honest government of her government and also the Workers' Party. So I've been given the easy task of posing just a few questions. Now I'm happy to turn it over to the gurus for the answers. So thank you all very much, and I'm sure you'll join this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's great to partner with the Inter-American Dialogue yet again, our second event together, and and many more to come. So thanks for that. Well, I think Michael pretty much summed up the panel, so we're going to go enjoy the rest of breakfast, and we have until 10. No, I'm just joking. No, anyways, thank you for the great introduction, Michael. Michael, I think you really laid out the key questions that we're going to focus on as part of this panel. There's a lot to talk about, both, what do the results mean? What does this mean for her ability to govern? What does this mean for the economy? What does this mean for regional affairs? And a whole host of other questions. And this is what we're going to look at over the course of the next hour and a half. We're going to do it in a informal Davos style setup. Short commentary by everybody. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end for question and answer. So definitely start to think of your questions now. But we're joined by I couldn't think of a better panel for today's event. To my left here is Andy Gunther. Andy is the Managing Director of Infrastructure at Darby. And Darby basically invests globally in infrastructure, pretty much.
Darby is a global emerging markets private equity manager.
Fantastic. And Andy, in addition to his knowledge of infrastructure, which is obviously so key for Brazil, also has a very acute knowledge of economic markets and financial markets. To Andy's left is John Perdue. John is the Washington correspondent for The Economist. But I think more pertinent to this panel, John is also the former Brazil bureau chief. He was the bureau chief from 2007 to 2010. Very interesting time in Brazil, John, right?
Yeah, things look very rosy then.
And John is also the author of, on that rosy setup, Brazil Takes Off, which came out, the special section of The Economist in 2010.
Yeah, we had the statue of the Cristo Redentor taking off on the cover of The Economist at the time, which was maybe a little premature, but it summarized how people were feeling about the country at the time.
And I remember seeing that cover also in bus stops all across New York City.
Yeah. Itaú used it as an advertising campaign, which as a journalist is something that makes you deeply uncomfortable.
To John's left is Ricardo Senes. Ricardo, we are very lucky to have as our non-resident senior Brazil fellow here at the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. He is also the managing partner at Prospectiva, a very well-known and prominent consulting firm in Sao Paulo. He's also the general coordinator of the Group of International Analysis at the University of Sao Paulo. But Ricardo is also just a well-known Brazil expert globally. I mean, but in addition to his bio, he is one of the foremost political experts on Brazil, and we're lucky to have him here. And actually, this is his debut public event with the Arsht Center.
It's my pleasure.
It feels like Hollywood.
It feels like Hollywood. He's also the author. I don't know how Ricardo did this, but he's also the author of our analysis of the election that came out at 10:30 in the morning the day after the election. So he looks very well rested now, but he was able to get this out very, very quickly on what does Dilma Rousseff's victory mean for Brazil's future. And you all know to Ricardo's left is Pietro Schechter, who's the director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. In addition to being the director of the center, Peter also has 20-some years of political experience, political campaigns, political consulting, political communications. So I couldn't think of anybody better to help to analyze the results of the election and the campaigns and what does this mean going forward. So we have a great panel here today, and I'm going to start off, Ricardo. The results are in. Michael went over the results. 3 percentage point difference. Dilma won with just a very narrow margin. What do these numbers mean? Does a 3 percentage point victory mean that she's coming in with a weak mandate? Where does her support? How did her support break down on Sunday?
Well, I would say that this election indicates that the political environment in Brazil has changed. If you take this election as part of a cycle that was basically led by the PT coalition, probably in this election we have an indication that the pattern of this coalition has been changed somehow. I think if you take just the first round and the second round, you can see how the Brazil not just divided in 2 blocks, but how Brazil is fragmented in terms of political groups. Because together with this, with presidential election, we do have a congressional election and the state level election. And when you analyze the results of the election, you indicate that the PT coalition at the federal level do not contemplate the other political force that we have in the country. So mainly the idea of the third way forces in the country. That means with Marina or without Marina, an alternative, political alternative in Brazil seems to be, start to be a representative for the next cycle. So I would say that probably this election was the last election from the PT cycle, and we will have in the next election a different environment in Brazil.
And Pietro, why, comment on Ricardo's point, but also want to ask you, why do you think Dilma ultimately won in the end?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to say about this election. I want to reinforce what Michael said. I mean, this was for Brazil, a nasty election. If you would be an American that was picked up by a UFO somewhere and transplanted in Brazil in the middle of the election, you would have thought, gee, this is a normal American-style election. Everybody's throwing mud at each other. But in Brazil, it's not normal. I mean, this was the level of nastiness here was very unusual for Brazil. And that would lead you to another American-style conclusion, because when you see the map, you see blue state and red state, right? You see the red states up north and the blue states down south. That's another conclusion that you shouldn't take and shouldn't Americanize, because I think what this election really was about was a socioeconomic vote. I mean, this, in a large sense, the people from the lower classes to this new, large, prospering middle class that came out over the last 10 to 12 years really made a decision that they felt more comfortable voting for the government. And I think the last thing I'd say about the election was that the governor of Minas Gerais lost Minas Gerais, and 52-48. And when I've been a political consultant for 20 years, and it's really bad news when you can't carry your own state. So, I think even if you would have looked at Minas Gerais and would have said that this would have come out 50-50, to a large extent, that 50-50 would have carried him over the finish line, but he lost it, and so I think that's one of the principal reasons that he lost the election. That leaves me with three questions that over the next couple of months, we're all going to see the answers to. One is, did he lose because he simply was not a good enough candidate? Because he simply was not able to formulate a cogent argument for change? Did he lose because people feared that he would take away what the PT has given over the last 10 to 12 years, which has given the opportunity for marginalized poor classes to really look at the possibility for a new life? And then the third question to ask us is, what happened to Marina? Where did she go? What happened to her? She was such a figure at the beginning, and then she wasn't even able to manage. She carried Pernambuco, but Pernambuco was lost very badly by Aécio. So I think those three questions are the questions that make up the sort of chemical mix of why Dilma won.
And I was getting, looking at the election results in Brazil in the blue and red state, I was expecting to see John King from CNN coming up next, and thankfully we have not brought the election map down to Brazil that we watch all night long here. John, Peter put out a few questions. If you want to respond to those, but also, what are some of the surprises that you saw during the election, the campaign, and also on Sunday?
Well, I think Marina's rise was a big surprise, and then her disappearance, in a sense, was equally large. Just in terms of the questions that Peter posed, was Aécio not a great candidate? I think he was not a great candidate. He's somebody I watched quite a lot when I was in Brazil between 2007 and 2010. And in a way, it was obvious why he was being touted as a future, kind of possible president who's governor of a big state. He had this, important political history, family history in Brazil, but he was not very impressive at the kind of stuff that retail politicians are expected to do in terms of, kind of making speeches, inspiring people, and so on. And that kind of matters. So I do think there was a bit of that. I feel like, this election as an outsider, I mean, I've been watching this while running around the country, looking at the American elections, and it is striking, you know, kind of both the similarities and the differences. It has been a more American-style campaign. That said, Brazilian elections, presidential elections, have been nasty before. I mean, if you wind back to the election with Lula against Fernando Collor, and you know, the sudden appearance of the woman who Lula had supposedly forced to have an abortion. I think that was pretty much as nasty as anything that's ever happened in an American political campaign. That said, as both Peter and Michael have said already, Brazil is a country that is kind of remarkably unified in a cultural sense, despite the kind of protests that we saw in the year before the election. I mean, all the so the swing states I've been visiting in the US, I was in New Hampshire yesterday, in North Carolina the week before. You know, the culture war stuff is such a big part of the election, and it's striking how really completely absent from the debate in Brazil that is. And I think that's a good thing for Brazil. Yeah. I think Peter also posed a question of, you know, kind of what do you go in a more market-oriented direction? My answer to that is no. I don't see any reason why she would, really. She had more of a mandate to do that last time around, should she wish to. I'm not sure that she will take from this result you know, a lesson that Brazil needs to kind of open up more to foreign capital. It might do so a little bit out of necessity, but I really don't think her heart is there at all. If there's any chance of some kind of reforms from her, I think there'll be more along the lines that Narendra Modi is pushing in India, which is a kind of bureaucratic reform. You know, try to get the machinery of government functioning better. That's something that Dilma talked about a bit in her first election campaign, and then sort of went missing a little bit. And I can imagine her trying to squeeze more value for money out of the state, but I can't imagine her turning in a more kind of market-friendly direction.
And John, we're gonna dive into the economics and the markets a little bit as we move forward the panel. And Andy and I also,
Just one more thing on the election.
Yeah.
Two things that kind of jumped out at me is one is that Dilma seemed to manage to run, in part at least, on a mandate of change, which is hard to do when you've been in power for 4 years and your party's been in power for 12 years, but somehow or other she seemed to at least partly do that. And the second was there was virtually no discussion of what her economic policies may be going forward.
yeah. And one of the things, you know, Andy, that we saw during the election as well, I know you saw this, is the correlation between the polls coming out and the reaction from the market, right? Every time a poll would come out and show Dilma in the lead, the market would respond in an opposite direction. And then yesterday, the Bovespa slid when the results were announced. How do you expect the markets to react to the victory in the coming days or coming weeks?
Well, yesterday, as you mentioned, the Bovespa was down, Petrobras was down 13%, which is an extraordinary outcome. Look, I think markets were pricing in sort of a 50-50 chance of Dilma winning and a 50-50 chance of Aécio winning, and clearly they preferred Aécio winning. So they reacted to that. Presumably, now Dilma's winning has been priced into markets. And I think the next big event will be announcement of her cabinet, who's going to be the finance minister, which would be a clue to what type of economic policies she's going to follow going forward.
Yeah, and Ricardo, you mentioned in this analysis you wrote in a matter of hours, a couple different options on finance minister. What do you?
That's a good question.
Right.
No, but just to add, I think two information about this, and two about the election response for this change demands before we come to this question. I think it's important to note that Dilma, during all this year, she kept a level of approval in terms of her government about 42%. That means 42% of the Brazilian population evaluates her government as a good and excellent. The another 39% of Brazilian population evaluate Dilma's government as a okay, it's a average. And less than 20% as a really bad government. That means this is not a situation in which you really demand huge change. You can understand that if the potential vote of Dilma would be when you put the 42% plus the 39%, 80% of the Brazilian population are saying, okay, and I want some change, but not a complete change. This, I think, was an important indication that Brazilian population are really approving part of the Dilma government and are saying, look, the next president should keep part of this political strategy, these public policies, and change part of this. Which part I think the population are demanding to be changed, to have news? I think the first one is what Marina tried to kept, that was a new way of doing politics. Mm-hmm. That means less corruption, less coalitions with no ideological sense. Part of these demands was not a concrete demand in a sense of public policy, but was much more related to behavior. The other demand was part of the social problems in Brazil that have not been addressed, like health, education, public transportation, this kind of stuff that is not included yet. I would say yet because we can see, we can expect that Dilma will increase some of these issues in some of these policies in next term, but haven't been addressed by Lula or Dilma. That was very much focused on income transferring programs rather than redesign the education policy, health policy, public urban policy. So I think the people are saying, look, it's okay with, by now, the fighting poverty, fighting the problem of inequality, but it's not enough. We need the second step. So the problem is that the opposition couldn't present an alternative for that. So the option will, let's keep Dilma, given a strong sign that we need something more. And I think this was the mix-up results of this. Sorry to be long in my response.
No, but I mean, you know,
And now who's the finance minister?
Well, I'm trying to escape from this question. Well, I think different from John that Dilma understood since November last year that some changes in macroeconomic policy are needed, really needed. Because if you take some signs, she indicates that Guido will not be anymore the minister. When she indicates in the middle of the election that she will change the Minister of Economy, probably she's not indicating that she will put someone more heterodox than Guido in the position. She's indicating that she will move somehow for the other way out. The second indication, we are, during the election year, Dilma raised the interest rate to 11%. I would say that a populist guy would not make this move if she's not really worried about the inflation and some losing control about the macroeconomic stabilization. So this is a tough decision to raise the, so part of the very low economic growth in Brazil has to do with 11% of the interest rates. So this, I think, is a second indication that she probably will move towards a more market-oriented sense. And the third indication is, if you take the energy prices in Brazil, she has been increasing the energy price in Brazil even over the inflation rate. It's another indication that, well, she understood, she made a huge mistake changing the energy policy 3 years ago. So this indication, I think, it's important. I think is enough to understand that. I don't know if the new minister will be Nelson Barbosa or someone like Nelson Barbosa, but I would say that the trend would be someone with this profile.
Yeah, Peter, and then I want John to react as well after you, Peter.
I just want to say there's a fourth indication, which is the speech she gave right after she won the election. I mean, this is a politician who goes into meetings and into speeches armed for battle. I mean, she's got, you know, she is a tough lady, and she gave an extremely generous, statesman-like victory speech. I mean, in which she called for national unity, in which she says, I need to be a better president, and being a and she defined what that meant. Being a better president means that I have got to talk and dialogue with the opposition. I have to attempt to try to create some bridges because I got the message. Now, maybe she's a bald-faced liar, but I don't think so. I mean, I have to say, when a politician, a president, goes out and says, I have to be a better president, and the way to do that is because I have to go seek a dialogue, and I'm not saying that she does that because she's only because she's generous and she got the message. I think there are other reasons to do that. There's the corruption scandal. There are the economic necessities that the country has today. But clearly, she feels that her political future is more towards national unity and dialogue, and that's going to mean some changes in the economy. That's.
So, John, can you react to Ricardo?
Yeah,
you guys
sure.
have different viewpoints
Sorry, we've
here.
left you alone there. In that.
No, I'm happy to be left alone. I think Nelson Barbosa would make a great finance minister. He's a good guy. I think that would be positive for Brazil. My query would be, I think if you go with this thesis that changing the finance minister for a more market-friendly guy sort of changes the government's economic policy, I think you'd have to assume that the economic policy for the past however many years has been run by Guido Mantega rather than by Dilma. And it's not clear to me at all that that's the case. I think to push Brazil in a more market-friendly direction will not be a hugely popular thing. I don't think Dilma will feel that from this she has a mandate to do it. And probably more important than that, I just don't think that's where her heart is at all. It's not where she is kind of philosophically. If you look at her sort of, her development as a politician, there's nothing in there at all to suggest that that's the direction in which she'd like to push Brazil. So I think while the choice of finance minister is important and will send kind of signals that the market will pick up, it'll be a question of kind of quite incremental, kind of small-scale changes if we get someone like Nelson Barbosa. I hope we do, rather than Brazil transforming itself into Chile or something.
Annie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the economic environment is very different from what it was. I also lived in Brazil from 2007 to 2010 when the Christ statue was blasting off on the cover of The Economist. And it's a lot tougher situation right now. Growth is low. Inflation's at the top of the range. There's greater fiscal deficits, greater current account deficits. There's not the level of foreign direct investment to finance those current account deficits that there was in the past. There's some pent-up inflation from some managed prices. So I think the country will need investment. I think Dilma will not put in jeopardy economic stability, relatively low controlled inflation, which we've had in Brazil for roughly 20 years. I don't think she'll put in play the investment grade rating of the country. So I think the country will go in a direction where it will become more market friendly, because I think the consumer model of growth in Brazil is kind of come to an end, and there's a need to get more investment in the country.
Yeah, and not to team up on you, John, but I come down with Andy on the market friendly. I mean, in some ways, what we've talked about, and is that Brazil has achieved some of the not easy steps, but the easier steps insofar as kind of access to services for the D&E class, insofar as kind of access to healthcare, access to education. But now it's the next phase of how do we improve the quality of education? How do we improve the quality of healthcare? And I'm not sure how she's going to be able to do that without more of an outward-looking approach, especially as the commodities boom is ending or has ended. I'm not sure what her options are.
There's also a big break on her options in the form of the PMDB, which will block these kinds of reforms that we'd all like to see in education and healthcare spending. So yeah, I agree Brazil's going to need more FDI. However, that FDI now is going to come on less advantageous terms than it would have come when Brazil was doing really well, for a number of reasons. I think there've been some kind of small changes that nevertheless people who watch markets kind of take seriously, around the perception of the central bank's willingness to clamp down on inflation. I know that, as Ricardo says, interest rates were jacked up in an election year, and in a sense, while that's really painful for Brazil, that's a kind of positive signal. But, inflation is a long way above the central bank's target. It took a long, long time in Brazil to build up that kind of economic credibility, and I think a bit of it has gone, not in a major way. Nobody out there thinks that Brazil is going to become Argentina or Venezuela, but frankly, I think that comparison, which people often make, is kind of patronizing to Brazil. There comes a stage where saying, oh, but we're so much better than Argentina and Venezuela, that doesn't really cut it for me anymore. you know, Argentina's been pretty much the most kind of systematically mismanaged government in the rich world for the past, you know, kind of 80 years. Brazil shouldn't, you know, Brazil shouldn't be comparing.
Being generous.
Right, but I think, you know, you could go back 100 years maybe. You know, and Venezuela is, you know, another story altogether. You know, Brazil is so much better than that. And I think a second term of Dilma is continuity. It's by no means, you know, kind of a disaster for Brazil, but the country really needs to reform. And also it needs to reform, it's still benefiting from this kind of demographic, you know, positive demographic forces, a kind of young population that ought to make it, in a way, easier to shift government expenditure from the kind of present on things like pensions to future, to investment in infrastructure, schools, you know, healthcare, and so on. And if there's a moment to do it, it's kind of now, before you get you know, voting kind of dominated by an older population that benefits more from this kind of structure. And I worry about Brazil missing out. I worry that it doesn't have time to just kind of continue as it has now. I mean, it's not going to be a disaster. I don't think everything's going to come crashing down, but...
You know, John, one of the things you mentioned, to shift topics a little bit here, is you mentioned the ability to work with the PMDB, with the PT's partner in Congress, to be able to move policies forward. And you know, after the election, the PT has, especially the PT-PMDB coalition, has less seats in Congress, than I think it's moved from about a third through the coalition in 2010 to a quarter of the seats now. If I could be correct me if I'm wrong. So what is the political scenario for? I mean, you know, the Brazilian system, for folks who aren't as familiar with it, really requires the consensus and the buy-in from Congress. Maybe unlike here, where we just use executive action to get things done sometimes. So what is her scenario, being able to work with her coalition partners, maintain that coalition, especially in light of a you know, a 3% victory? And I want maybe turn to maybe John, we'll start with that and turn it over to
I
Kirk.
think that's going to be incredibly difficult, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's going to be hard to expect some big change of direction from Dilma. But Ricardo, you should speak to that, really.
Okay. Well, I think the Dilma election, together with a Congress election that indicates that the level of fragmentation in Congress will be even bigger than you used to have. Now we will have in the Congress 28 political parties. PT has diminished in the Congress. PMDB has diminished. PT now for the new Congress will be about 13% only. So that's why they make a complete difference when you compare with Venezuela and other countries. PT is not the Peronism in Argentina. It's not to do with Chavismo in Venezuela or Evo Morales in Bolivia, because PT is not the majority of society. PT is the leader, a minority political force that has been able to lead the majority of the coalition that controls the country. It's not PT controlling the country. He is the leader of a coalition that's completely different. And PT understand that they are not a majority of society. Because not just in the Congress, but if you take the state levels, PT is not controlling the state levels of governors. In this election, PT has the Bahia, Piauí, Minas Gerais. That's a good news for PT. And probably another state, Ceará. There will be 4 states. So it is nothing if compared with 25 states. So PT knows that they is a minority force in the country. The puzzle for them is how to control a coalition that includes so many other political forces. PMDB, that used to be a critical ally for PT, has been diminished in the House, but continues to control the Senate. In the Brazilian division of issues between the Senate and the House, we have a different model, because the Senate in Brazil has also some issues that is not usually associated with the Senate. So part of the public policies, the political decisions are made at the Senate level. And in the importance of PMDB in Senate, it's much more relevant than the presence of PMDB in the House. So the other question is how PT, besides the PMDB alliance, will have to include another 10 or 12 different political parties. To deal with these other parties is not easy, not in a sense that the PT have to divide all the federal level apparatus with the other political parties, and we'll need, in some circumstance, to be very close to a kind of bargain situation that we know very well about the Brazilian situation.
Right.
Again, I think the corruption in all these scandals is not related, in my perception, with PT itself. It's related to this very complicated environment in which the state is very large. The state is one of the biggest investors in the country. So there is money going out from the state from different sides, controlling by a very heterogeneous coalition with no single control. It's impossible to imagine that Dilma at the Palácio do Planalto is controlling 20,000 people working for the government.
Yeah.
So the 20,000 people, positions in the federal government, is allocated politically. So it's impossible to imagine that everybody is under control of the president. It's crazy thinking. It's easy to think that the problem is PT. For me, it would be a best answer to say, okay, remove PT and the corruption in Brazil would be okay. It's not. It's an institutional problem, for sure. So the problem is how to keep the majority in the Congress, majority in the Senate, together with a coherent macroeconomic policy, and including some social policy. It's a major.
It's a huge challenge.
It's a huge challenge.
Huge challenge, and be able to not only maintain that coalition now, but throughout the next 4 years as well. Peter, how do you see her?
No, I was just going to add. I think this is one of the most difficult jobs. I mean, I don't envy her at all. I mean, she really has an amazingly difficult job. And as Michael said in his excellent introduction, you know, she's clearly comes into this a relatively weakened president. And the big wild card here, in my view, is the corruption scandal, because this is a large corruption scandal. This is not going to be a minor thing. If there's one thing that's clear about Brazil, is that there is a really great independent-minded, not cowable press corps in Brazil. And I think that they're not going to let this go. And you know, and it won't be swept under the rug. And I think that one of the great challenges that the president has as she goes forward is, how do you lead this? It's already difficult enough to lead this fractious coalition that wants to go in 28 different directions all at the same time. But you know, politicians are much better than sharks at smelling blood. If there is even the slightest sense that this scandal is creeping upwards, that coalition, you know, and I'm not saying that at all that that's going to come. I'm just saying that if, you know, this is the way politics works. I mean, that is going to be a much more difficult coalition to manage and keep together over the long term.
And this obviously this Petrobras scandal, folks might not know, is about, you know, money laundering and potential, you know, kickbacks. And this is the prominent Veja magazine released an article, very prominent article about on Friday, you know, 2 days before the election. The magazine actually came out early, and so there's kind of clearly,
It was a little weird, but
a little weird, and there's clear, you know, media forces also at play here. You know, Andy, your firm and you particularly work a lot with kind of investment infrastructure, energy, specifically in Brazil. I mean, how do you see, from an investor standpoint, this Petrobras scandal kind of affecting the appetite of the international community to go into Brazil, or do you see this as, you know?
You know, it's really difficult to predict how these things play out. You know, I remember during the Mensalão scandal of Lula, there was all sorts of discussion about him being impeached, and he ended up leaving office as, you know, one of the most popular presidents ever. So, you know, I think Petrobras shares went down 13%, so there's some concern there that with the Dilma government in power that the company has not been managed the way the market would like it to be managed. How big an issue this is going to be, I think is just really hard to predict at this point.
Does it?
By the way,
is
it
it-
happened to Bill Clinton too, right? I mean,
What's that?
it happened to Bill Clinton too, exactly what you said about
Yeah,
Lula. You know? He
right.
left office much after the impeachment process.
And left
he ends
office
up left
popular.
office very popular.
Yeah.
Yeah, and still is. But one of the things that we're talking about here as well is kind of the necessary kind of improvements that are needed in Brazil. I mean, Brazil is obviously, on the whole, very positive. You look globally, you look in Latin America, Brazil is a very attractive investment destination. Things by and large are going very well. 40 million people have left the middle class, have entered the middle class, left poverty, entered the middle class. You're very stable rule of law, a democracy that's very strong, and so on the whole, things are going very well. But from a kind of outside investor standpoint, especially in kind of the necessary improvements in infrastructure and whatnot, how does this election what do you have a change in appetite in Brazil, or do you see this as kind of a continuation of?
So we're very much long-term investors in Brazil. We've been investing there for 20 years, and we expect to be investing there for another 20 or more. I think people get excited during the time of 2007, 2010, maybe a little bit of irrational exuberance, and maybe there's also there's a swing in the other direction right now in terms of pessimism. Look, I think Brazil still has some very big strengths that people are not focusing on. So it's a very large economy, so you can create some large companies, large foreign exchange reserves, as you mentioned, middle class. It's a tremendous accomplishment to have lifted 40 million people out of poverty into the middle class. You've got world-class agriculture, you've got good business people, you've got large oil reserves, you've got a solid banking system. So Brazil's, it's hard to know whether Brazil is going to grow very rapidly over the next years or is going to kind of bump along. But there's still huge investment opportunities in Brazil.
John, do you see, you wrote about 4 years ago in Brazil Takes Off about the foreign investment is pouring in, attracted by a market boosted by falling poverty, swelling lower middle class, strong political institutions. Do you still, and we had the launching of Brazil, do you still see Brazil launching?
Yeah, I think all of that's true, and the reason we stuck it on the cover at the time was that it was during or a little after the financial crisis had begun here. And one of the really striking things I found living in Brazil during the financial crisis was that in previous rounds of kind of world, economic panic, Brazil had always been one of the first countries to get sick and and for things to go kind of disastrously wrong. And in a way, the financial crisis that started here in 2007 was a kind of stress test on the Brazilian institutions that had been set up since the redemocratization in the 80s, and particularly the kind of economic institutions from 1994 onwards. And Brazil did okay, and that was a fantastic thing. However, I think it is more likely that growth will kind of bump along at a relatively low rate, may not even outpace inflation, in fact probably won't, and that Brazil, there won't be any kind of great crisis, but one Brazilian economist put it to me once, that Brazil's economy travels with the handbrake on, which means that it's never going to grow too fast, and in a crisis, nothing's going to go too disastrously wrong either. And while I can see that might be a superficially attractive thing to try and avoid kind of global swings, you miss out on the upside of when you have the handbrake on. And when you've got as many, we talk a lot about this 40 million figure of Brazilians entering the middle class. It's not really an American definition of middle class. It's a relatively low, these are still, a lot of these people are still quite poor, and there are still people below them who need to be, kind of sucked into this consumer society. And in order to do that, in order to accomplish that successfully, Brazil, I think, needs to be growing faster than it is at the moment, and then it's likely to grow over the next few years. And so those are my concerns. Sorry, that's a rather long-winded answer.
No, and you know, the middle class is a very different definition of how we do. I mean, it's also a middle class that's very susceptible to falling back into poverty.
Right.
You know, you have a sickness in the family, someone loses a job, and it's you know, not just in Brazil, but kind of regionally, it's not as stable as a middle class as we would necessarily define it here. Peter, you know, John's mentioning the Brazilian multinationals from Brazil, something I know you like to talk about. Do you see a continued growth in the Brazilian, you know, the multi-Latinas from Brazil? I mean, there's significant investments in the United States, but also on the reverse, you also see significant U.S. corporations investing in Brazil. Is this going to be the continued wave of the future?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to pick up what John said, which I think is absolutely right. I mean, and what Ricardo said. I mean, we're ending this phase. We had the first consolidation of the economy phase. You know, now we had the sort of the social inclusion phase, I think you called it. And you know, the next phase has got to fuel the country's growth, because all of these things that are needed next are expensive stuff. I mean, you know, the infrastructure that Brazil needs, the hospitals, the roads, the schools, et cetera, the real ramping up, the catapult to go to that next phase is very expensive stuff, and it can only be paid for by growth. And the country cannot afford not to grow and to bump along, as we've said, along the straits. And so that, you know, I think it has created over the last couple of years some enormously successful companies. I love to introduce the new Latin America, talking about, you know, it's very difficult for any Americans, any of us, to travel on an airplane less than 300 miles, and that airplane's Brazilian. I mean, it's going to be 70% chance that Airplane's Brazilian. One of the largest investments in West Virginia in the history, maybe even in the history of West Virginia, is going to be a Braskem petrochemical plant that is going to take advantage of the shale gas in West Virginia to invest there. So I think there's, you know, Brazilians are incredibly innovative and dynamic people. So their companies are great to finance. You know, Itaú, you look at your magazine, every week Itaú is the Latin American bank, you know, and they're on a buying spree. They want to become the largest bank in Latin America in 2020. So, I mean, I think the fundamentals are there, but Brazil has got to grow.
And I want to turn to regional with Andy, but before that, just Ricardo, just a quick follow-up on Peter's comment. You know, the next phase of Brazilian development, to be able to really kind of tackle some of these more difficult, in some ways, you know, social issues. How do you see that coming about? And also, we haven't talked about yet the protests during the World Cup that largely, you know, subsided during the election. You know, the Olympics is coming up in 2016, potentially another opportunity to vent frustrations. You know, do you see a continued kind of social demands placed on the government, and the government having to respond to those social demands, and how will that square with kind of taking the necessary economic reforms?
Well, I would say that for sure the social demands will continue to be in place. Would be almost impossible to step back in this area. But the challenge of Brazil, I think, would be basically two. One, increase the level of investment in the country. Brazil has been pursuing a model in which the drive would be consumption rather than investment. This is something that if you take the Brazilian economists and government, they say this every single day, we need to increase investment. When Lula took power in 2002, the investment in Brazil was 17% of the Brazilian GDP. They peak in 2008 like to 23%. And now it's again 17%. 70% as investment, percent of the Brazilian GDP as investment is nothing. Yeah. It's impossible to keep the growth. If you compare with India or China, they are twice bigger than Brazil in terms of investment capacity. So this is a challenge that the Lula and Dilma couldn't not answer, because part of this increase in terms of investment was public investment. Petrobras and spending in some infrastructure investments, but they couldn't put all the private sector in the same drive. So this is, I think, it's a huge challenge because we have problem with in terms of Brazilian costs, what we call Brazilian costs, that is not being reduced during this 10 years. Even the opposite have been increased. Is still invest in Brazil. And secondly, we have a problem in specific for the industrial sector in Brazil, the problem of competitiveness. The social benefits that was the increase of the minimum wage have implicated, in one hand, the increase of purchase capacity of the Brazilian population. Brazilian market has increased, but on the other side, it became even more costly to produce in Brazil because all the salaries is going up. The unemployment is very low, so it's very hard to employ people with competitive salary. So how the problem will be how to keep the social policies in place together increase investment and increase competitiveness. This is not a single equation. But from one side, we have this huge opportunity in infrastructure. If you take not just the pre-salt investment cycle, that is huge. We are talking about like $200 billion in investment in the next 4 years. Wow. It's a huge, just for Petrobras pre-salt investment program.
It's the biggest capital expenditure budget of any company in the world. I think it was when I looked at it.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's too much concentrated in one single company. This is a problem. But at the same time, the drive is there. We have this rail investment program, roads investment program, energy investment program. So infrastructure, if this was even the position economist, Arminio Fraga, he mentioned that this is a potential that Brazil has, and for them would be one of the drivers for the next cycle. That means just adjust the environment, just some regulation, and allow this investment to come in. So this would be one of, I think, very strategic step for Dilma.
Yeah. So Andy, how will Brazil increase this investment?
Well, I agree with. I think it's really important what the panelists were saying about you can't grow at 1 or 2% if you really want to make inroads on reducing poverty and making people's lives better. You need to grow 4 or 5%. And so a lot of the problems are hard to solve. So education problems, health problems, transport problems. But I think that infrastructure is a place where there is some, I call it relatively low-hanging fruit, okay? Brazil's invested roughly 2% of GDP in infrastructure for the last 25 years. So it's way too low for a very, very long time. And the government is really committed to trying to do more in infrastructure. They've talked about a $270 billion program for private sector investment in infrastructure. And they've had some successes already in airports, in roads, in energy, particularly renewables. And there's huge gains to be had here, just as an example. So a farmer in Mato Grosso and a farmer in Iowa, which is the kind of the heartland of both countries, are both quite efficient and world-class in agriculture. But the farmer in Mato Grosso may be paying 20% more to get his crops to market. And so if you can improve upon that, there's a huge potential gain in productivity, not just for that sector, not just for infrastructure itself, for the investment that comes there, but to all the benefits that would derive from it. And I think that if the government is able to put together good projects, bid them out through PPPs, through concessions, you will find investors for those projects in a place like Brazil.
So what needs to be done differently moving forward to be able to get the interest from investors? Obviously, there's been interest in the past, but there's a need for even greater interest.
I don't think it's a question of a lack of investor interest. I think it's a question of execution on the part of the government. And this is hard everywhere in the world. So to prepare, a road project, for instance, to be bid out is a 1 to 2 year, endeavor in terms of putting together studies, a model. What does it cost to refurbish the road or expand it? What does it cost to, what is the likely traffic? I mean, it's a complex process. Yeah. I think it's more a question of the government executing on things like getting projects out for bid, getting regulation right. And all of these things tend to be things that can be done without legislative approval. So it's more within the government's hands. And I think if they can execute, I think investors will be there, and there's a huge possibility for gains in productivity. Yeah.
So I'd like to turn to regional, global, and also U.S. Brazil for the next few minutes before we open up to questions. I think we've done a lot of comparison on this panel of Brazil with Argentina, or I think Ricardo, you're mentioning Argentina or Venezuela, Bolivia, and whatnot. But I think in many ways we have to look at Brazil as a different type of comparison. I mean, Brazil is very much now an increasingly global power, and so I think John, you were mentioning the comparison with India before, and is increasingly more of a player in the BRICS specifically. Hosted the BRICS meeting in July, and a driver before for the creation of the recent BRICS Bank. How do you see? Maybe John, I'll start with you here. How do you see, Brazil under a second Dilma administration? How do you see their global relations, specifically the relations with the other BRICS? Do you see that being their? Dilma has taken a much more of a step back insofar as her global engagement than Lula did. And do you see the BRICS as the potential kind of outlet for global engagement, or do you see a different type of shift in the next 4 years?
I think Dilma is not really a foreign policy president. I think we knew that already. I don't see her changing that hugely in the second term. In terms of the relationship with the BRICS, I think that is something that she puts a great store on. It's something that's always puzzled me a bit, that something that was the creation of a sell-side research department and an investment bank should become such a kind of driving force in foreign policy, in Brazilian foreign policy. There's something a bit sort of gimmicky about it, I think. And I think it looks more troubling now, given what's been going on in Russia recently with Ukraine, given the protests in Hong Kong, with China. I can see there's a kind of superficial attraction for Brazil. These are, big, emerging economies. But other than that, they have so little in common. And actually, I would say that more than that, at least, Russia and China have sort of political values at the top of the government that are so antithetical to Brazil's values that it troubles me somewhat that the government should be placing, kind of so much emphasis on that.
I think the BRICS, I agree with you. The BRICS is kind of a very artificial construct. They don't have that much in common. I think it's mostly just a counterweight to, the U.S. and Europe-dominated institutions. That's really what it is.
Yeah. Ricardo, you're nodding your head yes as well.
Yeah, I think in the issue of BRICS, I think Brazil was smart enough to take a free rider with the BRICS idea. Actually, he was leveraged to a level in which Brazil itself, I think, would not take. But there is one single concrete agenda that unified BRICS. That is IMF and World Bank vote power reforms. So in this sense, we have been seeing that these four countries have been acting quite strategically. The other issue, I agree, is there is nothing concrete behind the environment agenda or trade agenda or security agenda. But back to the other issues in terms of foreign policy, I believe that in the second term, Dilma will change part of the strategy related to U.S. I think there is some signs that Dilma will recover part of the agenda that we lost with U.S. after the spying problem. If we take in consideration that, for instance, the jets, military jets that Brazil were about to buy, was previously the spying problem. The most probable partnership will be with U.S. So if we didn't have this problem of a spying problem, this very strong sign that a strategic relationship in the military area would be with U.S. Yeah. So it's not a problem that Dilma cannot handle. But I think after the elections, she will change, not in terms of a political accommodation with U.S., but in a very concrete sense, like energy, technology and innovation, and probably some issue of trade, we can expect a better, improve in the U.S.-Brazil agenda. I would say that Europe, even for the PT point of view, it's much more easy for them to work with Europe than with U.S. But the problem is what Europe haven't much to offer to Brazil right now in terms of trade opportunities or investment. They are too much concentrated in the domestic agenda rather than the international agenda. So as BRICS is not an option, Europe is not an option, I think US would be the only possibility, and Dilma will take this as she really needs to improve economic aspects of Brazilian economy. So in the last one is the regional issue that I think is important, because we can expect in the next 4 years problems in Argentina, deep problems in Argentina. Of course, we have the election next week, but next year, and the Peronism will win. I think Massa probably will be the next president. He will handle better than Cristina and the macroeconomic crisis, but probably is not solve the problem. So Argentina will continue to be a problem for Dilma. Dilma have been, I think, the only issue, international issue that Dilma really included in her agenda. It's Argentina. I think because Argentina is part of domestic problem, not because it's international agenda. Right. And the other is the political crisis in Venezuela. Brazil is too much engaged in Venezuela for different sense to not move a finger if we have a really political crisis in Venezuela. So this is not issue that Dilma would like to deal with, but is an issue that will bring to Dilma agenda.
And in Argentina, that's why we were serving empanadas, if you were wondering why there are empanadas before.
To help Argentina
to event, to help Argentina and to talk about Brazil-Argentine relations as being so important. You know, Ricardo, I'd also add education is something that the U.S. and Brazil are also working very strongly on. But I want to turn over to Peter for comments on kind of where do you see the future of the U.S.-Brazil relationship? What must be done what must be done from Washington's standpoint as well to show signs of improvement with Brazil, and then let's turn into some of the regional discussion.
Well, I mean, I think we have had from Washington. This is a lot of the problem, which a lot of people describe as an ideological divide between Washington and Brazil over the last 20 years. I mean, it has been to a large extent the inability of this city to look at Brazil as a real partner. I mean, this is a major power of 200 million people and real emerging power with values that are tremendously similar to ours. I mean, it's a country with a past that is amazingly, if you would go down the histories, both had to break free of colonial powers, both had an enormous influence of Africans being brought here against their will, that played a large role. I mean, we could play this game down 200 years of history and find enormous amounts of similarities, and this, it's both incredibly Western valued countries, and yet we sit there with our backs towards each other, and much of that fault is not Brazil's. Much of that fault lies in Washington, D.C., that it is unable to see beyond the Middle Eastern crises and that continue to crop up over and over again, and to see a strategic partnership with a major emerging power in Brazil. So I think the part of the problem is we need to screw our heads on right, because there's enormous opportunity. There's enormous opportunity south of ours, not only in trade, not only in energy, but also to begin to sort of concert Western values, to reassert Western values to a world which is to a large extent rejecting them. There's a great opportunity of partnership there. I think, last thing I'd just say about regional, and we should go to questions, is, just to be simplistic and elementary and a little bit funny, Brazil has had over the last 10 to 12 years, 3 foreign policies. They've had an ideological foreign policy, they've had a commercial foreign policy, and they've had a traditional foreign policy run by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I think to a large extent, what I would expect from this president, with a lot of the issues, problems, challenges that she has before her. She wasn't a foreign policy president to begin with. I think she's going to be less of a foreign policy president in this term. And I think, the Brazilian government will really play its commercial foreign policy card. They're unbelievably good, as good as the U.S. used to be, but the U.S. long is not very good at it any longer, in really defending their companies and advocating for their companies and advocating for commercial opportunities for Brazil. The government is extraordinarily adept at that, and I think that that's the foreign policy they're going to play. They have made a huge mistake at allowing Venezuela into Mercosur. This was Dilma's big foreign policy blunder, I'd say, because they've injected sort of the poison into Mercosur, which is now no longer seen as a viable economic union, but rather seen as just another political meeting place for Latin Americans.
Yeah. And I asked you during his campaign, and even in Uruguay, they've talked about now about finding trade deals outside of the Mercosur parameters. John, I want to get you to react. Think of your questions, because after John, you react, I want to open up to Q&A. But just if you could react on Ricardo's point about Europe, Brazil. We are, after all, the Atlantic Council here, and whether you see, from the economist standpoint, kind of opportunities in that regard, and also now that you've played the role both in Washington and in Brazil of leading economist coverage. What do you see as the future relation?
On Europe and Brazil, I think you're right. Europe, I spent a bit of time in Brussels for the FT. Europe's in a deeply introverted moment and is trying hard to work out its own sort of internal institutions. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult to cut any kind of big trade deals, with the outside world, were it in, So I don't see, a kind of huge upside there. With America, there's so much potential for upside in the relationship for some of the, reasons Ricardo and Peter have outlined. But I think it goes both ways. I mean, I think Washington does turn its back on Brazil to some extent, and that, that is a shame. But there's also, Brazil turns its back on Washington. My big boss, interviewed Barack Obama recently, and they were talking about, sort of what was going on in the world, and he talked about Brazil, and he is somebody who actually, knows the country. He reads a lot, and his view of Brazil is that the government is still, kind of slightly in the kind of mindset of blaming America for a lot of kind of economic ills. I think he was quite struck I think it was 2008, when he was sort of freshly elected, or 2009 perhaps. He went to a meeting of other kind of American leaders, and Hugo Chavez presented him with a book explaining to President Obama why, kind of everything that had ever gone wrong in Latin America was the fault of the USA. And so I think, people within the US government kind of still think that, Dilma comes slightly from that mindset, and there's some evidence to believe that that's right. And also that Brazil's reluctance to either sort of solve problems in its neighborhood out of kind of, a feeling of delicacy towards relations with Argentina or Venezuela, or to, involve itself a bit more in things like the diplomacy over Russia, tends to mean that, kind of Washington slightly kind of, says, oh, well, this, they can't, we ought to be friends on this, we ought to be working together, and we're not, so, maybe they're not really that serious, and we're so distracted because we're the superpower and everyone else wants our attention that we're not going to put too much energy into kind of, into this relationship. And it's a shame on both sides.
Yeah,
It's a really important point.
Excellent point. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. If you raise your hand, there will be microphones roving. If you could identify your name and affiliation before asking your question, and keep your questions short, would be great. First question here, fourth row. Thanks, Layla.
Alec.
Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Alec Watson from Hills & Company. I wanted to pick up on a comment by Ricardo earlier about political reform. Dilma, after the election, said she's going to have a referendum on political reform. Some people see that as a device for getting at the corruption issue without having to address the specifics of the corruption issue. I wonder what you think she has in mind when she talks about political reform.
Thanks, Alex.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ricardo.
I think she had in mind two issues. One, PT has already presented, I think last year, bill related to restriction of the political representation of the small political parties in the Congress when this political party didn't reach 3% of the national voting. This is a kind of threshold element that Brazil is about to approve, because the big and medium-sized political party in Brazil, they agree with this. The problem would be small political parties like Rede or other new political parties that are serious political parties. They do have some ideology, but they will be affected by this law. But I think there is it's not a consensus in Brazil, but there is an environment in which I think seems necessary to approve this. The second would be the public financing for campaigns in the country, in Brazil. I think after this problem of corruption in general sense, not just in PT, all the other political parties was involved in somehow in corruption and what we called a second cash flow management. They use for everybody. Everybody knows that is necessary to implement or any kind of a campaign in Brazil. So I think this, the regulation of this element will be the second topic for Dilma political reform.
Great, thank you. Question here in the second row. Thanks, Jadir.
Thank you. My name is Vladimir Yakovlev. It sounds doesn't sound English or Latin, so let's forget it. My ancestors come from that side. I'm with the Pan American Academy of Engineering. I'm an engineer, have been a professor all my life. All you distinguished panelists mentioned the increase, the economic uplift of Brazil and so on. But you have mentioned one important thing, education. And I think that is a very important thing in all of Latin American countries. Let me refer to an anecdote. A few years back, I was talking with a colleague in the Colegio de Ingenieros of Venezuela, and another group was talking about 4 people, about 10 feet across, and a distinguished professor came walking between us. And he's a PhD from Stanford, was a professor at MIT, has been a long time dean, professor, all the academic credentials you want in Venezuela. And those guys said, there goes Dr. So-and-so. He teaches because he's no good for anything else. That is a cultural problem that exists in Latin America.
Well, so let's talk about education, quality of education. I think is your question.
And I think you mentioned Brazil is one of the things, education, but it's not Brazil, it's all of Latin American countries have that problem. And I think in particular that cultural thing that education is not worth it. Right. And that's why salaries of teachers are very poor in most countries, or in all countries in Latin America.
Can we get to answering your question?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, thanks. So, I wouldn't agree that it's education is not seen as culturally important across Latin America. I think that it's quite the opposite. But I think one of the issue here is kind of how do you improve the quality of education? We've done a lot in Brazil on access to education. Look, I'm going to take that. You work very closely.
I'm not an education expert. The only thing I would say is that it probably is one of the most fundamental issues in Brazil. Because if you think about it and you want to increase the reach of the middle class, it's very hard to have a middle class salary if you have a third-grade education. Just what is the job you do to have a better opportunity? And so it's clearly a very long-term problem, increasing quality of teaching in the country overall.
Mm-hmm. Especially with the increase in engineering and whatnot, there's been a real need for STEM-specific education. Did you want to make a quick comment on that, John?
Oh, yeah, one of the things, well, first of all, I suppose this is a problem that all countries face. Everyone is trying to improve their public schools. Brazil starts with this. The reason I think it's difficult in Brazil and it's taking a long time is it starts with this kind of historic deficit in education and literacy, which goes back a long way. And I really think it takes time to recover from that. I mean, printing presses were virtually illegal in Brazil until the middle of the 19th century. Kind of the whole idea of kind of public schooling is relatively new compared with many other countries. And one of the things that impressed me when I was based in Brazil was the extent to which Brazilians were trying very hard to make up for the deficits in their education as children, as adults. The number of Brazilians, kind of newly middle-class Brazilians who are studying at night school and picking up extra qualifications is a really hopeful thing. But obviously, you need to get the public schools better. It's something America struggles with. It's something that all countries find hard. There are some sort of innovations going on in Brazil, and I'm hopeful that some of those might work out. But you don't see the fruits of this quickly, and all we know about improving education is that it's very, very difficult. And the other thing, just very quickly, is that Brazil, in relative terms, still spends too much money on higher education, which tends to benefit the children of relatively well-off people, compared with what it spends on primary and secondary education. And so there needs to be a shift in the kind of public resources that go towards education, towards earlier education.
Yeah. And Peter, I've just been really impressed going down to Rio and seeing the public-private partnerships in the schools in Brazil that I think would be the envy of many of us here in the United States.
Yeah, I just want to make a very quick point. I mean, before I became a think tank guy, I was a political consultant that did polling. I mean, education is a major political issue in Latin America, almost everywhere. The last elections in Chile were only practically about education.
Yeah.
And so if you take a poll now on whether it's Colombia or Mexico or Brazil, I mean, education is now one of the creation of the middle class has made education a huge, huge issue. And every government is now faced with the conundrum of not only how do you build more schools, but how do you improve the quality of those schools, the education.
There's a bunch of other questions. Actually, we'll take these two questions here together.
Hola, my name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I work for Mitsui & Co. There's a huge water crisis going down in the south of Brazil, and that has enormous implications for the agriculture sector and the energy sector. Does Dilma have any policy, at least in the back burner, about how to deal with this? And will the political climate, which is a little tougher now, impede any long-term, reasonable solution? Thank you.
Great question. The other question.
Ana Luisa Farias, I'm a journalist, and my question is, you mentioned in the beginning the new environment, the new political environment in Brazil, and it's undeniable that the opposition became stronger. If it didn't win the election, but it certainly came out stronger than it started. My question is, do you think that this will create some momentum for the necessary reforms, or will it lead to a stalemate, just like we see in the U.S. right now?
Great, thank you. Let's see, the water question first is a great question.
Our water
we haven't tackled yet.
Well, the point is the water is not a federal issue, it's a state level issue. The problem, and one of the questions behind the water crisis in Brazil is the federal level, the federal agency that regulate water use in Brazil is not fully aligned with the state level entities that manage water. So I don't know much about this, so I cannot answer you better than this. The issue about the opposition, I fully agree with you. I think now we have an opposition. I would say a possibility to have an organized opposition in Brazil, because in the last 10 years, I think we really have this. So the question is, will Aécio Neves take the lead of the opposition in Brazil? I think he has opportunity to do that. PSDB probably will merge with them, another political party, and will be a little bit stronger than they are today. And of course, they have a stage to at least to start to operate as an opposition, real opposition political party. Not just no, as Peter said yet, not just saying no, 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 but at least start to say what the alternative would be for the current model. Besides this, we have two elements that we have to consider in this new environment. One is what will happen with PSB. The Socialist Party in Brazil probably will merge with the PPS, and also would be an interesting alternative for the next election. Of course, the lack of a national leader that, as we had, as in Eduardo Campos, will be a problem for them. But we do have a political party that has the idea to build a third way besides the PT and the PSDB. The point will be, with no national leader as Eduardo Campos, would PSB continue to be this third way alternative? And the other element is Marina and what Marina will do in the next year. The one alternative would be Marina will take again the idea to build the Rede, a new political party, and try to use Rede as a platform for present itself as again as a best alternative for the new cycle. But Marina, in my perception, is in a very complicated situation right now. So the decrease of support that she suffered, the way that the public opinion do not trust her during this election was so deep, I think, in a message that the alternative of Marina is not that solid alternative. Yeah. I think will affect very much the capacity of Marina to be the third element on this game.
Great. Let's take. I saw your hand. I think it's the fourth row. The Jadira, second one in, and then let's take all three of those questions together.
Hi, my name is Rafael Salias. I work for Southern Pulse. I have a question for Ricardo. Could you, keeping in mind that the opposition is now stronger in the Senate, could you go on a little bit deeper in how that presents itself as an opportunity given the Senate's different attributions in policy making in Brazil, please?
Great, thank you. And there was another question to your, if you could just pass the microphone down to you. Go, end of the row and then behind you.
Hello, Matthias. I'm educated now at George Washington University here. I just wanted to know, we heard about the homogeneous society culturally in general in Brazil, and that there was no profound demand for change. Nevertheless, we saw a very nasty public debate that was mentioned by the panel as well, not only between the candidates, but in the public debate in general. So what changed in Brazilian society, and is there something which will pose a future challenge to Dilma in order to really unite the country again?
Thanks.
Bob Kozak, Advanced Biofuels USA. I just want to say first, we're doing some stuff right now with biomaterials, University of Sao Paulo, and there's some great people down there. So anybody that's saying anything about education, I will say it's good stuff. Over the past 4 years, in terms of gasoline prices and ethanol prices, the way that Dilma kept gasoline prices well below ethanol prices, which had the effect of wrecking the agricultural sector of Brazil at the same time, not exactly helping Petrobras because oil had to be imported at prices lower than you're being sold. And given the amount of infrastructure investment that would be needed to get agriculture back up, primarily railroads, and the amount of amount of infrastructure investment that would be needed to get oil moving again, do you see her really changing her policy under 4 years? Do you see any forces that would cause it, or would we just see more of the same?
Great, thanks. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to take I'm going to take two more questions, and we'll take them all together. Michael had a question up in the front.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say this has been terrific, and thank you to all of you for excellent comments. A few questions. Peter, going back to was Aécio a good campaign and a good candidate? Is there anybody who says that somebody else from the PSDB would have been better? Is there any other name that's come out? And similarly for the PT, is there anybody else who would have been better than Dilma, where she would have had a PT candidate would have had a greater margin, or a PSDB would have posed a stronger challenge? The other thing is, I'm just curious to know, Ricardo's first comment about the end of this cycle. No one's really mentioned a lot about Lula. And when I after the election results on Sunday, I got an email from a Brazilian friend who said, who was an Aécio supporter, who said, I'm thinking of moving to Europe now. We have our bags packed because I don't know if we could take 4 more years of Dilma and 8 more years of Lula. Could the PT possibly reinvent itself? And could Lula become a real agent for that transformation? Or should we just assume that this is over, as you implied? And the third thing, really, I think the consensus among all of you is that sort of there'll be some modest marginal changes, but not much, especially John is clearly the most skeptical of the three of you. But I'm just curious to know, if we were sitting here and Aécio had won by 2 or 3 points, would the conversation be much different? Would we say that there'd be just a little bit more change or not much more change? You know, John said, well, Brazil's not transforming itself into Chile. Well, you know, what if Aécio had won? It wasn't going to transform itself into Chile either. I mean, Brazil is still Brazil. So I'm just curious to know reactions to that.
Great question. I'm going to take you had a question. I think there's a last question over there, and we'll answer all these. Thanks, Javier.
I'm Yvonne Gonzalez from the State Department Brazil desk. And following up on Michael's question, I'm just wondering specifically about Lula's role over the next 4 years and his influence on Dilma. I've heard some commentary before that she potentially would have a greater ability to make independent decisions from his influence, and that could mean that she would be able to implement a more pragmatic or a more economic-driven policy. Just want your comments on that. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm gonna have let's see, Ricardo. You could the question about the change in the public debate, the Senate and Lula. Peter, the question about would there have been a better candidates and the future of Lula as well. John, will have you address the question about would the conversation have been different if Aécio had won, and Andy, the question on biofuels and agriculture. And if you wouldn't mind starting, that'd be great.
Oh, okay, sure. So as the questioner mentioned, Petrobras has essentially kept gasoline prices artificially low because, I guess, as a break against inflation at a huge cost. I don't remember the exact amount, but it's in the billions of reais of subsidies, essentially buying oil expensive and then selling it cheap domestically. There's actually an interesting opportunity right now to do away with that policy because oil prices have come down. So the gasoline prices are getting much closer to, maybe even at parity with what they should be if you were selling them at parity. So the background for this is that the only refiner in the country is Petrobras, so they effectively have a monopoly. So I think it would be helpful if the subsidies were eliminated. Good for the agricultural sector and sort of good at allocating economic resources. And I think Petrobras is under increasing financial pressure. So there may be some pressure from markets in terms of its investment grade rating, its ability to raise capital, which it raises in enormous quantities, such that the policy may be moderated or eliminated. We'll have to see how that plays out over the next months.
Mm-hmm. John, would the conversation have been different if Aécio had won?
Yes, I do think it would have been different. I think Brazil is averse to political change in an institutional sense, much like America is. So, it's difficult to steer the country from the Palácio do Planalto, just as it is, hard to just get whatever you want done from the White House. But I think to say that it, didn't really matter who won the election is to kind of think that politics doesn't matter, and I don't think that's right. I mean, I think the PSDB, the changes that were made when Fernando Henrique was finance minister and then later under his government have stood the country in tremendously good stead. I don't think Aécio would have been as this kind of transformative figure partly because I'm not sure he really knows what he wants to do. I think he's the sort of person whose management style in Minas Gerais was very much one of, kind of allowing good people around him to kind of make changes. And that's actually not a bad thing. So I don't think he would have transformed the country, but I do think there would be a different feeling in the room this morning and a more positive feeling about Brazil had he won. That's not to say, Dilma's a disaster.
Ricardo, a question about the kind of change in the public debate and also the specific question about the Senate. And then I'm going to ask both you and Peter about the Lula factor.
Well, I would say that it's not clear that PMDB controlling the Senate would have a different role in the next Dilma's term. Actually, PMDB, it's divided in at least 4 different groups, but two of them must be part of the Dilma coalition. One is, of course, the area of the PMDB controlled by Michel Temer, the vice president, and also the part of PMDB controlled by Renan. Renan probably will be the next president of Senate. It's a critical position. This guy is very powerful. Now there is the alternative for Renan would be Sarney that have left the politics. So there is no alternative for Dilma rather than go back to Renan and put him in a part of the coalition. And Renan will operate, in my perspective, in 2 ways. One would be part supportive to Dilma, and second, I think PMDB will start to organize themselves to have probably a candidate in 2018 that will completely change the game for Dilma, I think, after the middle of his term. So I think we need to think about this dynamic with the next 2 years, and after this, think another 2 years with a different scenario.
Okay. Pietro, would there have been a better candidate, and what's the Lula factor?
Oh, I don't know if there would have been. I mean, let me just take the Lula factor. I mean, I think Michael, it's a great question. Remember, one of the things which differentiates Brazil from any of the countries that we mentioned, which it shouldn't even be compared to, whether it's Cristina or whether it's Chavez, and a number of other countries, is that, remember, let's all not forget that when Lula was, his popularity was 90%, he decided that he needed to step down and somebody else needed to take over. So this is a huge differentiation, and and I'm sure it's one of the reasons why he remains such a fundamentally popular figure and such a crucial reference for all Brazilians, whether they agree with him, whether they're PT, whether they're not PT, et cetera, et cetera. It's also pretty well known that Lula and Dilma didn't get along very well over the last couple of years. And even during the campaign, that there was some considerable friction between them. And this has been amply covered in the Brazilian press. Whether it's exaggerated or not exaggerated is really indifferent. I mean, there's so much of that information out there that I think is pretty true. And the last thing that seems to be true is that Lula's back. Lula's back in the group. I think part of the reason that he's back is because I think the president understands that in this fractionalized reality that she now has to live in, she needs somebody who is what Ricardo calls an operador, a political operator, somebody who can manage coalitions. It's not something that she does very well. She likes she doesn't like large groups. She doesn't like to, argue with people. She doesn't like to give. She and Barack Obama have a lot in common. They don't like to get their fingers dirty, right? So they ought to get to know each other better. So I think Lula is going to have a much more prominent role, at least in the beginning here, than he has over the last two or 3 years. Will that translate into him being back? I think that depends on a lot of things. Depends on Brazilian growth. Depends on where this corruption scandal goes, and it depends a lot on what we were talking about. Is there an opposition, and is there a voice for this opposition? Because at the moment, it's not clear that ASU is going to sort of either be the voice, should be the voice, or even desire to be that voice. As a Brazilian friend of mine told me the other day, if you had a wife as beautiful as that, would you want to be the opposition? So,
Well, on that note, I was trying to think of a great closing line. You got it right there. So I want to thank our panelists, Andy, John, Ricardo, Peter, for making our first, not a teleconference, our first public event on Brazil. So a lot of fun and also very informative. So a huge success. There's going to be much more to come from the Art Center and later on this year and in 2015 as we follow the administration. I want to especially thank Michael Shifter and his team at the Inter-American Dialogue. As I said at the beginning, this is the second time that we've partnered together on an event, and it's just a great partnership, and we look forward to many more opportunities to work together and combine forces. And then lastly, but I think in many ways most importantly, I'd like to thank our team, Natalie Aljonte, who I think is outside right now, who put together this event with Abby Moore in the corner, as well as Thomas Corrigan, Gabrielle Hasson, Rachel Levy, Ori, Jadira, and Layla, who are passing the microphones around. So thank you, everyone from our team, for making this such a great event, and thank you all for spending your morning with us.